Jane Austen was not the most popular female author of her day. That title goes to one of her favourite authors, Maria Edgeworth. You may or may not have heard of Maria Edgeworth, but in the first couple of decades of the 19th century, she was the most successful and celebrated English novelist. She earned more money in her lifetime than her contemporaries, male or female, from her novels, and she influenced some of the most important names in the 19th century. She was well received by critics and readers alike, being credited with being one of the most important figures in terms of the development of the medium of the novel within the European tradition. She was also an essayist, which was rare for women at the time, and she wrote extensively about education and wrote stories for children. At this time, women writers were popular, and there were more of them than you might think, and Maria Edgeworth was up there. So today I'm going to be diving into one of the works of my favourite author's favourite author. I picked one book to start with, Belinda, and it's Maria Edgeworth's second novel. If this isn't your first visit to my channel, you know I like to sort of put some context around the books I read and the history. So I'm going to be talking a bit about Maria Edgeworth, I'm going to be talking about her relationship with Jane Austen, and diving into the review. Everything is going to be broken up with chapters, so you can skip around and have a look. And there will be a spoilery section in the book review portion, which I will have labelled. If you do like this, do give it a thumbs up. I make videos all about books, history, culture, etc. So do check those out and subscribe if you would like to. Maria Edgeworth comes from an Anglo-Irish family, which is basically just a code for the English Protestants who settled in Ireland and their descendants. She was born in 1768 in Oxfordshire, and she was one of her father's 22 surviving children by 4 wives. She spent her early life living chunks of time between England and Ireland. Her mother died when she was 5 years old in 1773, and when she's 14 years old, she returns to Ireland long term to kind of take charge of her younger siblings, to be home tutored by her father in many areas: law, economics, politics, literature, science. She uses this knowledge to very much become her father's assistant, managing the Edgeworth Town estate, and the two of them very much become an academic team as well, with her father saying of which she was the more able and nimble mind. Maria Edgeworth was very much inspired by Edgeworth's Town, the people, the estate, and she drew on those experiences when she was writing her novels about Ireland. There seems to be conflicting reports about her relationship with the people of Edgeworth Town and Maria Edgeworth and her family, so I won't get into that too much, other than to say that she, set up school for the local children of all denominations. She saw education as the key, not only to personal improvement, but also as a national improvement. She was in favour of gradual Catholic emancipation, and she used a lot of her novels to combat stereotypes of Irish people and culture. I will say Maria Edgeworth's approach to the Great Famine was mixed. On the one hand, she wrote a book, Orlandino, with profits going to the Relief Fund, and she wrote extensively to the Quaker Relief Committee, providing an extensive account of the plight of her tenants in Edgeworth Town, the conditions they were living under, the struggles she'd been going through to sort of get aid for them, though she did manage to get some from America. However, she did insist that only the tenants that paid their rent in full would receive relief, so it's a mixed bag here. There were many people in her life who encouraged her writing, her father especially, her aunt who gave her Anne Radcliffe books and William Godwin novels. Maria Edgeworth did use her writing to talk about issues that were important to her. In fiction, she wrote extensively about different religions, racial, class, national and gender issues. Maria Edgeworth's first published work was in 1795, and it was called Letters for Literary Ladies. She wrote this in response to Thomas Day, who said that women should not be authors, or indeed taught to think. One of the essays within the volume, an essay on the noble science of self-justification, talks to women, saying that women should use their gifts to challenge the force and power of men, especially their husbands, with their wit and intelligence. This essay was satirical and funny, and people have said that it explores the feminine argumentative method. Maria Edgeworth was always advocating for the rights of women. She believed in equal and co-educational opportunity for young people. The work that made Maria Edgeworth a household name and the most successful novelist of her age was Tales of Fashionable Life, which focused on the life of women. The first collection of short stories was published in 1809 and the second in 1812. It was the second collection particularly that really took off, and it made her the most highly regarded female writer in England. Edgeworth was definitely a proto-feminist. She believed that becoming an old maid was a better option to marrying someone that, didn't suit you. She wanted women to achieve self-realisation, and she also encouraged more women to participate in politics. Maria Edgeworth also wrote for children. Her first children's book was published in 1796 called The Parent's Assistant. Her children's work were very moralistic, but also very innovative for the time because she stressed the importance of children having independence of thought. Maria Edgeworth also wrote a lot of non-fiction, particularly about education. Her 1798 work, Practical Education, which was co-written with her father, it was a treatise on the theory of education. Edgeworth believed in a scientific approach to education, sort of trying out different methods to see which worked best for each child. Methods that went beyond just repetition, including scientific experiments, fun maps. Learning should be a positive experience and education should be held up as the goal in itself, other than like being a walking encyclopedia. Maria Edgeworth's first novel was called Castle Rackrent, which was published in 1800. It was written and submitted for anonymous publication. She didn't even tell her father, who was obviously very encouraging of her career. Edgeworth was one of the few writers at the time who defended the novel as a way to educate people. And so when you read her novels, it's kind of obvious the moral lesson you're supposed to be taking away from them. In terms of her writing style, Maria Edgeworth sits sort of in the middle of 18th century Enlightenment tradition of Rousseau and then the early 19th century realism that she kind of helped to create. She inspired Jane Austen and writers like Sir Walter Scott. There are also flashes of Gothic elements, especially in Belinda, actually. So Maria Edgeworth blends realism, social commentary, satire, and moral didacticism. Especially within realism, Maria Edgeworth was applauded for her ability to sort of observe and comment on the world around her rather than romanticize it, which was common at the time that she was writing. She was very big on rationality over emotional sentimentality, and that definitely comes across in Belinda. She also had her inspiration herself. Fanny Burney was a huge one for Maria Edgeworth. Burney's popularisation of the courtship novel was very critical for Edgeworth's popularity and women in general being able to thrive as novelists. Similarly to Horace Walpole, actually, when I was talking about The Castle of Otranto, there's that separation of like high and low characters that have different forms of speech and are judged by different moral conventions. That's very Shakespearean. I have to say though, Maria Edgeworth was very open to criticism and always willing to learn and grow as a writer. Her later works often addressed criticisms that had been laid against her. When her 1812 novel, The Absentee, was published, she received a letter from an American Jewish woman complaining about the depiction of Jews in the novel. And after this, the woman, Rachel Mordecai, became a regular correspondent of Maria Edgeworth, and she was, an avid reader of hers, not only her novels, but her and her father's educational books. Fun fact, Mordecai's father was also an educator and he set up a school for women where Rachel taught at. So there was a lot of common interests and parallels between the two of them, and as a response to this correspondence that they were having and this friendship that they were building, Maria Edgeworth ends up writing the 1817 novel Harrington as an apology to the Jewish community. So talking about Jane Austen and Maria Edgeworth together, this is obviously about my favourite author's favourite author, so I'm going to take a look at their relationship because they were definitely aware of each other. Jane was a fan of Maria Edgeworth's writing. In a letter that Jane wrote to her niece Anna, who herself was an inspiring author, Jane said, "I have made up my mind to like no novels really, but Miss Edgeworth's, yours, and my own." In Northanger Abbey, Jane uses Belinda as an example in her defence of the art form of the novel. "Oh, it's only a novel," replies the young lady, while she lays down her book with affected indifference or momentary shame. "It is only Cecilia or Camilla or Belinda, or, in short, only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humour are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language." The first draft of Northanger Abbey was written in the 1790s, but this was one of the sections that Jane added before submitting the novel in 1803. Jane Austen even sent Maria Edgeworth a copy of Emma when it was published, and we know this from a letter that Edgeworth sent to her aunt. However, the admiration that Jane held for Maria Edgeworth was not just one way. Edgeworth wrote in a letter to her cousin that "we have been much entertained with Mansfield Park." We also know that Edgeworth read Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. In a letter to her aunt, she spoke about Northanger Abbey. "The behaviour of the general in Northanger Abbey, packing off the young lady without a servant or the common civilities which bear of a man, not to say gentleman, would have shown, is quite outrageously out of drawing and out of nature." A woman of taste, she had great things to say about Persuasion. Persuasion, excepting the tangled, useless histories of the family in the first 50 pages, appears to me, especially in all that relates to poor Anne and her lover, to be exceedingly interesting and natural. The love and the lover admirably well drawn. Don't you see Captain Wentworth, or rather, don't you in her place feel him taking the boisterous child off her back as she kneels by the sick boy on the sofa? And is not the first meeting after their long separation admirably well done? So Jane was a fan of Maria Edgeworth, and Maria Edgeworth enjoyed and read Jane Austen's work, although she had her critiques, as any senior would. So now I'm going to be talking about Belinda. Belinda is the story of our eponymous hero, Belinda Portman. This was Edgeworth's first 3-volume novel, and it was published in 1801. Belinda Portman comes from a family that are known for making marriages above their station, with the aid of an aunt, Mrs. Stanhope. Belinda is sent by her aunt to the home of Lady Delacour to be out in society. However, Belinda finds out that Lady Delacour's home life does not live up to her public persona. She is miserable, her marriage is full of constant fighting. Lady Delacour has an admirer as well called Terence Hervey, who is clever, arrogant, and frankly a stubborn know-it-all. You think this is going to be the traditional courtship novel, but it ends up taking a lot of twists and turns, and I think if any other author had written this book, it would have been named after Lady Delacour, but Maria Edgeworth and her focus on the morality of things, she gives us Belinda to follow and to root for. Belinda is a courtship novel, which was a kind of novel that followed a heroine through the process of finding a husband. It was a subgenre of the novel, and it sort of developed and thrived between 1740 and 1820, written by women for women, and it helped to feminise the English novel as an art form. Overall, this book was easy to read, it's not overly stylised, and the language doesn't seem dated like other classics that I've read. In terms of the pacing, there's no extraneous description, it's quite plot and character focused, but the third act I think could use some editing, but I don't know how much of that was used to sort of fill out the third volume novel side of things. I would describe the writing in Belinda as fearless. Maria Edgeworth doesn't shy away from depicting topics like infidelity, cancer, its effects and, on the sufferer and those around them. Topics I'll get into later like interracial marriage, laudanum addiction, women doing things they really shouldn't be doing like dueling and wearing men's clothes. Again, I'll be getting into that. While the women's movement has its beginnings in the 1850s, the courtship novel is the perfect example of the shift that was happening in the 18th century in terms of women in England coming to be recognised as individuals in their own right. The courtship novel came to be a medium through which the primary audience of these novels, women, well, middle and upper class women, could see their values and problems represented. They were placed front and centre, so it was the domestic setting, glorifying the middle class proper lady and reducing men to lesser roles. That infamous letterbox Pride and Prejudice review, which is like a bunch of people visiting each other's houses, like the public were let into these kind of private domestic spaces reserved for women in a way that they weren't seeing that before. So the moral lesson, like I've talked about previously in this video, Maria Edgeworth is big on the moral lessons. So this is a moral of manners, and this is what she said about Belinda. The following work is offered to the public as a moral tale, the author not wishing to acknowledge a novel. Were all novels like those of Madame de Crouzaz, Mrs. Inchbald, Miss Burney, or Dr. Moore, she would adopt the name of a novel with delight, but with so much folly, error, and vice are disseminated in the books classed under this denomination that it is hoped the wish to assume another title will be attributed to feelings that are laudable and not fastidious. What I would say the moral lesson of Belinda is that Maria Edgeworth is demonstrating the importance of making up your own mind about a situational person. If you have good judgment and stay true to your feelings, you can't really go wrong. Ignore what other people say or what they think is best for you, friends, family, society, meeting societal expectations. Strive for sensibility and rationality, and something I do appreciate, being a hater of the miscommunication trope, is that there is another focus on being honest and everyone having all the information they need to make an informed decision. To choose the right path is often difficult, and I think that's why Belinda is the title character. The independence of thought and sound mind that she displays, they are the sort of moral compass for the reader. No wonder Maria Edgeworth liked Persuasion when it came out. Now I'm going to talk about the ladies. When it comes to this novel, there are sort of 4 ladies that the reader are invited to compare with each other. There are sort of 3, but I've added a 4th because, I'll get into that. So we've got Belinda, Lady Delacour, Lady Anne Percival, and Harriet Freke. The novel kind of explores the concept of the ideal woman, the ideal mother, and kind of uses these 4 when doing it. Starting with Belinda, she's the moral compass of the narrative. She's a country girl, 17 years old. She's found herself in the big smoke and been placed in Lady Delacour's care by her aunt, who encourages her to sort of make the most of all of her accomplishments, put herself about, find herself a good match. The fact that she is Mrs. Stanhope's niece follows her around like a bad smell. She's gentle, kind, forgiving, that final one is important, patient. She finds herself looking for a role model and a friend in a couple of the other ladies, but also ends up becoming a steadying influence on other people, just despite being 17 years old. I personally find Belinda quite tame, but critics at the time were actually infuriated by Belinda actually making her own choice of a husband, like having multiple suitors, not looking to anyone else for advice. Clarence Hervey states that she has dignity of mind and simplicity of character, and her aunt Stanhope describes her on the first page like this. Mrs. Stanhope did not find Belinda such a docile pupil as her other nieces, for she had been educated chiefly in the country. She had been inspired early with a taste for domestic pleasures. She was fond of reading and disposed to conduct herself with prudence and integrity. Her character, however, was yet to be developed by circumstances. Lady Delacour is by far the most interesting character in the book. And actually, from a writing perspective, she feels like the protagonist in the sense that she changes the most over the course of the book. She has that, growth character arc. She's rich, fashionable, witty, brave, and admired by many. However, she's also unhappy, paranoid, jealous, jumps to the wrong conclusions. She contains multitudes. She's very much not boxed into a villain type character or a heroine type character. She would have absolutely thrived in the modern day, I feel like, if she had had all the rights that I have. Oh my God, look out, world. She's very much a performer, and Belinda just talks about her like this. Abroad, she appeared all life, spirit, and good humour. At home, listless, fretful, and melancholy. She seemed like a spoiled actress of the stage, overstimulated by applause and exhausted by the exertions of supporting a fictional character. When her house was filled with well-dressed crowds, when it blazed with lights and resounded with music and dancing, Lady Delacour, in the character of Mistress of the Revels, shone the soul and spirit of pleasure and frolic. But the moment the company retired, when the music ceased and the lights were extinguishing, the spell was dissolved. Being a mother and a wife doesn't come easily to her, compared to this next character, which is Lady Anne Percival. She is supposed to be the foil of Lady Delacour. She is kind, gentle, unjudgmental, intelligent with a great love of literature. Belinda sees her as kind of like an ideal figure, an ideal woman, ideal mother. She takes care of everyone, Belinda included. And her marriage is very much a love match, and her family is sort of the representation of the ideal family. Lady Anne Percival is described by Clarence Hervey like this. Whether her eyes were large or small, blue or hazel, he couldn't tell. Nay, he might have been puzzled if he had been asked the colour of her hair. Whether she were handsome by the rules of art, he knew not, but he felt that she had the essential charm of beauty, the power of prepossessing the heart immediately in her favour. The effect of her manners, like that of her beauty, was rather to be felt than described. Everybody was at ease in her company, and none thought themselves called upon to admire her. Normally, the idea of sort of pitting women against each other is such a no-no for me, but with the way this novel is done, it's not done maliciously. At least that didn't come across to me. Each end up being the best versions of themselves. Some need a bit more help to get there than others, and some have to do more inner work than others, and each have completely different struggles throughout the story. Although I've got to say, Lady Anne Percival doesn't struggle all that much. I'll just put it out there. My fourth lady is Harriet Freke. And yes, I listened to the audiobook. It is pronounced Freak. She is an antagonist of this novel. I'm going to talk about her more extensively in the queerness section of this video because she's very much written to be queer-coded. If you are meant to compare Lady Anne Percival and Lady Delacour in terms of the ideal woman and mother and wife, then Harriet Freke is there for the reader to sort of compare to Belinda, both in terms of her personality, but also her as a friend to Lady Delacour. Harriet Freke is bold, unrestrained, but also cruel and calculating. At one point, she jumps into Lady Delacour's carriage in men's clothing, introducing herself to Lady Delacour's companion as, "Who am I? Only a freak." So there are a couple of very significant things to note in this novel when it comes to race. First, I wanted to point out the significance of Belinda Portman's name. Portman Square in London was built up between 1765 and 1784 on land belonging to Henry William Portman. Portman Square was home to some of the most prolific slave owners in London. James Blair, who lived at number 3, he was the biggest recipient of the compensation paid out to slave owners via the 1833 Abolition of Slavery Act. Slave ownership was very much not restricted to the aristocracy. You had a business lobby that was emerging, which were called the West Indian planters or their heirs, who, though they were rich, it was very much that sort of old money, new money situation. They would never be accepted in the centre of society, and so they kind of operated on the margins. They had their own social groups, one of which was, living around Portman Square. What Maria Edgeworth meant by this was up for debate because I've been doing research about her, obviously, for this video, and I found myself confused about her stance on slavery. I mean, personally, I think that she was trying to say that Belinda was this fish out of water. She's ended up on the fringes of the world, that she doesn't fit in and she never will. But, like these West Indian planters, She was still an English person of a certain status, so she had her place in the order and in society, but she should still know her place. I'm not going to go into detail about Edgeworth's feelings about slavery. I will say that her views don't come from a racist place, I feel anyway. She wrote a novel that centered around a slave uprising in Jamaica, and she had written in a letter to a friend in the US. In the US, slavery was incompatible with the American notions of liberty. Though she and her family don't have any connections to the slave trade at all, she didn't have problems corresponding with, and she had a friend who was a slave owner that we know for sure. So from everything she's written, like, her perspective comes from being a rich landowner. For her, I think it's all about class and not really about race. However, I'm always willing to be corrected. So if you have more information, do let me know. Belinda contains a very controversial interracial marriage for the time. There is a character called Mr. Vincent, who I'm going to get onto in a second, but he's got a manservant called Juba, who was an African West Indian young man, and he ends up marrying an English girl. Juba is loyal, brave, kind, hardworking. He's only ever presented in a positive light. There's no insinuation that his sort of birth or heritage has given him any kind of innate flaws, which I know is the bare minimum, but I just thought it would be worth mentioning. So the woman that Juba ends up marrying, Lucy, she's the granddaughter of one of the tenants of Lady Anne Percival, and this connection is obviously intending to put a positive spin on things as well. By association, anything associated with Lady Anne Percival is kind of automatically green stamp of approval. Also, it's accepted by her family. Lucy's grandmother calls him a most industrious, ingenious, good-natured youth. Juba is quite stereotypical in terms of his characterization. He calls Mr. Vincent Massa, he talks in dialect. This marriage, unfortunately, was a casualty of the 1810 edition of the novel. It was actually edited out. Lucy marries another man, an Englishman, James Jackson. So, even among liberals at the time, interracial marriages were not looked on very highly. Many black slaves ended up in Britain at this time as both paid and unpaid servants, and it wasn't uncommon for them to end up marrying lower-class English girls. However, this was kind of basically the first time that a marriage was given the rubber stamp of approval in fiction. The sort of white supremacy and colonialist framework saw marriages like that to be worse than a black woman marrying an English man. White men having all the wealth sustained the colonial project, and, on and on it spins. And, the interracial marriages like that upset the system, especially rich men of colour, like Mr. Vincent. So Mr. Vincent is a significant character in the books. So when the reader first meets him, he's described like this. Mr. Vincent was a Creole. He is about 22. His person and manners were striking and engaging. He was tall and remarkably handsome. He had dark, large eyes, an aquiline nose, fine hair, and a manly sunburnt complexion. His countenance was open and friendly, and when he spoke about an interesting subject, it lighted up and became full of fire and admiration. There's a debate among academics as to what it meant when calling someone Creole in this period. For some, it means someone who is of African descent in the West Indies, be it wholly or partially, and for others it's used to describe anyone of any race who's native to the West Indies and raised there. However, based on the evidence, it's obvious to me that Mr. Vincent was meant to be mixed. Mixed people were not uncommon in Regency England and Regency fiction, despite what some people would have you believe. However, as a suitor of Belinda, a white woman, you wouldn't see something like that commonly. This courtship, Mr. Vincent's feelings for Belinda and Belinda considering marriage with him, that was edited out of the 1810 edition also, and personally that's enough to me to signify that he was supposed to be a man of colour, because otherwise, why do that? The readers of the time clearly understood him to be mixed. People just wouldn't care if he was white, especially this is what she had to say about the reason why she let the interracial marriage between Juba and Lucy and the romantic nature of Belinda and Mr. Vincent's relationship be edited out. My father says that gentlemen have horrors upon this subject and would draw conclusions very unfavourably to a female writer who appeared to recommend such unions. And Mr. Vincent as a character, he's presented as a complete gentleman. He's the former ward of Mr. Percival. Again, you've got that association. He's rich, he's generous, passionate and honourable. Sadly, he's a plantation owner. Other than that, he's the sort of perfect suitor for Belinda, and indeed they get on very well together. Mr. Vincent, he does have a pretty big flaw, which I won't get into until the spoilery section. It was a positive step for representation at the time that Mr. Vincent was treated like any other man and was a suitor for Belinda that other people talked about and recommended their union as a positive one. This isn't a man of colour, this is a man with all the flaws that entails. Personally, I couldn't care less about the love triangle. I enjoyed Mr. Vincent as a character. I'm so happy to find out that, people were writing about this in 1801, because there are so many people that, just scream that only certain actors can be in Jane Austen adaptations, because it's like, do you think there were any white people in England? I mean, obviously, I talked about upper-class Indians being very much within English society, upper-class English society, in my video on Bridgerton season 2, if you want to check that out. So next I'm going to be talking about queerness. Queerness in this novel is complicated because obviously this is published in 1801 and there's no way to sort of explicitly determine a character's sexuality in that way from this, but obviously there are inferences and a few interesting instances of characters deviating from social norms as well that I wanted to talk about. Something that I found very interesting is that there are a number of characters of both sexes that are cross-dressing in this novel at various points. Clarence Hervey puts on a hoop skirt at one point to try and win a bet. He introduces himself to the company as Madame de Pomenars. Personally, I quite like this for a romantic love interest. There's no toxic masculinity here. In him is a perfect sort of healthy mix, well, not perfect, a healthy mix of sort of the masculine and feminine, and an appreciation for how hard it is to navigate the world as a woman, because he does struggle with the skirt. However, the most significant things to talk about are the women that dress in men's clothing and why. Lady Delacour even dresses in men's clothing to fight in a duel with another woman who was also wearing men's clothes. For most of the novel, she thinks that this incident has ruined her life. Dueling was a masculine activity. Upper-class women weren't going around using pistols to shoot at each other. Something I found super interesting is that none of the cross-dressing scenes were removed for the 1810 edition, and I find it super interesting that cross-dressing, women going into men's spaces and doing things reserved for men, and Harriet Freke as a character, even as an antagonist, was more palatable to Regency readers than interracial marriage. Though I've got to say, I'm not that surprised. Lady Delacour's frenemy and antagonist, Harriet Freke, is very obviously queer-coded. She wears men's clothing all the time. I feel like she's definitely coded to be a lesbian by Edgeworth. At one point she talks about when she was a schoolboy and corrects herself to say girl, so we potentially have a trans identity going on here as well. She never shows any interest in men in the novel, despite being married, and she lives with another young woman who has run away from home and who also dresses like a man. But, like I said, you can't definitively say anything, but, the signs are there. Harriet Freke dresses in men's clothes for various reasons. Firstly, because it feels right. She was always at ease, and never more so than in male attire, which she had been told became her particularly. She supported the character of a young rake with such spirit and truth that no common conjurer could have discovered anything feminine about her. She's also described as having bold masculine arms, showing she doesn't shy away from doing masculine activities. She's built up significant muscle. It gives her the freedom of movement that she treasures also. Harriet Freke also dresses in men's clothes because it allows her into men's spaces that she as a woman is banned from. After Harriet Freke jumps into Lady Delacour's carriage, like I was saying earlier, dressed as a man, she tells her that she has spent the day in the gallery of the House of Commons to hear a specific politician speak, which women, if they wanted to go to the House of Commons at the time, there was a gallery right at the top for women and children. Harriet Freke is so interesting to me. She's so complicated. I've seen her be called a straw feminist because she's clearly calling for more rights for women and a change in how women are perceived and treated. Talking to Mr. Percival, Harriet Freke rages against the delicacy of women, saying that it enslaves them. She goes on to say, "I hate slavery. Vive la liberté! I'm a champion for the rights of women." And when Mr. Percival states that he advocates for women's happiness and thus he is for their delicacy, as in his opinion it contributes to their happiness, Harriet Freke says this, "I'm an enemy to their delicacy, as I am sure it conduces to their misery." Facts. She's speaking only facts here. She's also a cruel, vindictive person. She is a bully. She attempts to turn people against each other in a really nasty way. I feel like she never becomes an outright villain in a caricature-y way. She does cause the love triangle to come to a head by her actions. As I get into the spoilery section, that will become a lot more clear. A lot of what we know about her from the first half of the novel is through Lady Delacour talking about their past. I didn't read this as Harriet Freke being made to be a queer-coded villain. Reading her as someone who is infuriated by the shackles that she finds around her. She finds she has no place in society being who she is, and her cruelty is a result of the intense anger and frustration that she feels, and it's her weakness of character that causes her to behave in the way that she does rather than her queerness. her being queer and so morally defective and all of that stuff. I think that's way too much of a reductive view of the way that this character is written. Maria Edgeworth, as I said, you can describe her as a proto-feminist, so I think she's not going to be disagreeing with a lot of what Harriet Freke says, but I think it's all in the nuance. It feels like she was lashing out at anyone and everyone in any way, especially when it's to do with someone who, she considered to be a friend or considered to be closely connected or whatever with, like Lady Delacour. Speaking of, the friendship between Lady Delacour and Harriet Freke is also something I could read a whole book about, and actually it's a major subplot that causes Harriet Freke to meddle with the other characters, because of their association with Lady Delacour. It's an intense friendship, and Lady Delacour describes it like this. I believe it was this aching void in my heart which made me, after looking abroad sometime for a bosom friend, take such a prodigious fancy to Mrs. Freke. She was just then coming into fashion. She struck me the first time I met her as being downright ugly, but there was a wild oddity in her countenance which made one stare at her, and she was delighted to be stared at, especially by me, so we were mutually agreeable to each other. I as starer, and she as staree. Lady Delacour shares everything with Harriet Freke, about her husband, about her life, about her past, and about the two of them she goes on to say, Lady Delacour's sprightly elegance was but pale, not to say faded pink, compared with the scarlet of Mrs. Freke's dashing audacity. As my rival, she would on certain ground have beaten me hollow. It was therefore good policy to make her my friend. We joined forces and nothing could stand against us. Harriet Freke, like I was saying, stands in opposition to Belinda as the kind of friend that Lady Delacour needs. When pushed away by Lady Delacour, the two of them act in completely different ways, and it's that, I think, that speaks to both of their characters, and it gets to a point where in the novel where associating with Harriet Freke ruins somebody's reputation by association. I loved this aspect of the novel. Harriet Freke and Lady Delacour, by far the two most interesting characters to me in this novel. They both struggle with the lack of freedom they have as women, their roles in life feeling, not suited to it, their household and society, and their friendship was so intense and volatile that it was so engaging to read. And again, the way that both characters react to their circumstances, it also invites that comparison. Harriet Freke is a character that you love to hate, and even Lady Delacour ends up feeling sympathy for her despite what has passed between them. And that, I think, is what allows readers to see the real nuance of Harriet Freke as a character, especially now when understanding villains and their origin stories and unpacking what makes them who they are is so popular now in TV, film and books. And I wish we'd known more about her childhood. I would have loved to have heard about that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the power of novels as well, because this is an important theme that kind of runs through Belinda. Belinda is very fond of reading. Many characters talk about different novels throughout the story. Early in the novel, Lady Delacour references Camilla and Cecilia by Fanny Burney, telling Belinda that she is thinking like Camilla and Lady Delacour like Mrs. Mitten. I haven't read Camilla yet, so I can't comment too much on that, but she goes on to say, novel reading, as I dare say you've been told by your governess, as I was told by mine, and she by hers, I suppose, novel reading for young ladies is the most dangerous. Again, reading is used to compare Harriet Freke and Belinda. Harriet Freke says this to Belinda, I did not know you were reading, girl. So was I once, but I never read now. Books only spoil the originality of genius. Very well for those who can't think for themselves, but when one has made up one's opinion, there is no use in reading. Harriet Freke advocates for conversation over reading. There was a chapter which caught my eye. It's chapter 13, which is called Sortes Virgilianae. Clarence Hervey is looking at a pile of novels and plays when he says, come, let us try our fate by the Sortes Virgilianae. So I did a little bit of digging. This is divination by bibliomancy, and God, that sounds cool. Basically, people would use the work of Virgil, who was a Roman poet, to try and tell their future. People have been doing this since the 2nd century AD, and in the medieval period, it was thought that Virgil had prophetic powers, so this is kind of how it came about. Lady Delacour opens the book to a description of a husband who was excessively afraid of being governed by his wife. And Belinda had been reading the book and used a myrtle leaf as a little bookmark. And Lady Delacour is convinced that the two of them, Clarence and Belinda, are sort of working together to teach her a lesson. Is that plant significant, might you ask? Yes, of course it is. Myrtle signified sort of love first and foremost, but also youth, virginity before marriage, fertility. innocence, fidelity. It's also an aphrodisiac, ironically, which meant it was often used in wedding bouquets. And in the Greco-Roman world, they signified victory from a bloodless battle, which I thought was quite significant, and was closely associated with the goddesses Demeter and Aphrodite and Venus. In addition, it was also associated with the Virgin Mary and Esther. It was also very fashionable amongst the aristocracy in the 17th and 18th centuries. So those were some of my unspoilery thoughts. Now I'm going to get on to some of my more spicy opinions. If you don't want major plot points spoiled, the result of Belinda's love triangle and many, many more things, this is your official warning. If you've made it here, it means you want to hear some spoiler opinions. I have to rant about this, I just have to. Clarence Hervey is the romantic hero of this novel, and I just can't deal with him. It starts off great. He's handsome, dashing, intelligent. Edgeworth really sells him as like a suitor for Belinda. You think you know where it's going. You're like, oh, the main conflict is going to be him realizing that he's misjudged Belinda and she's not a husband hunter. Like that's how they're going to, get together, right? He will overcome his arrogance and judginess and become a better person that way. That would be great. I'd have totally been on board with that. We could have had proper yearning. There is some yearning, but you do get the sense that he has feelings for her, but he kind of disappears from the main action and he's dealing with, other things. We find out what he's dealing with when we get into his point of view. We find out the reason that he kind of disappears and the reason he hasn't let his feelings for Belinda lead to a proposal is because he has a ward, right? That he picked up in the forest after seeing her, and he saw her like pure innocence. He saw a blank canvas and he decides he was going to raise her to be his wife. Educate her in all the things that he wanted his wife to know until she gets to an age where they can marry. He is following the teachings of Rousseau here. Simplicity and seclusion, that was his whole thing. Hervey was so disillusioned with the artifice and the shallow flirtations of the society ladies, but he overcorrects into grooming. He literally gives this girl a new name, a character from a book that he read called Virginia. We don't know how old she is when they first meet, but I've had a scour online and the consensus is she's 15 when they meet. He feels himself promised to her, and so he, out of honour, because he's such a good person, doesn't pursue things with Belinda. Fun fact, something that makes this whole thing even worse, so maybe not so fun fact, Maria Edgeworth based this off a real life story of a best friend of her father's. Thomas Day, you may remember him from earlier on in the video. He was the guy who she wrote her first published writing as a response to, who said that women shouldn't, be educated, shouldn't be taught to think. Thomas Day, he was a writer. He was inspired by Rousseau's book called Emily, or On Education, which was published in 1762. Book 5 of which talks about the education of Emily's wife-to-be. I won't go into detail about what he says about the education of women, but needless to say, there is a section of a vindication of the rights of women in which Mary Wollstonecraft attacks Rousseau in his arguments specifically. It's so fucked. I'm sorry, it's the only way I can describe it. I'm gonna tell you the story. Here's another timestamp if you don't want to hear it. Thomas Day goes to the Foundling Hospital. He adopts 2 girls, aged 11 and 12. He told the hospital that they were going to be maids in Maria Edgeworth's father's household. What's worse is that he makes a donation to the Foundling Hospital, a large one, and ends up on the board. Did Richard Lovell Edgeworth know that he was supposed to be responsible for these 2 girls? Not for months. He just didn't tell him. This is what Thomas Day wanted. His wife should have a taste for literature and science, moral and patriotic philosophy, so might she be his companion in that retirement. He resolved also that she should be as simple as a mountain girl in her dress, her diet, her mannerisms, fearless and intrepid as the Spartan wives and Roman heroines. Again, the quote from Pride and Prejudice comes to mind here about all of those accomplishments that women should have seeming impossible. Day renames these girls. One of them he renames after Emily's wife-to-be from Rousseau's writing. Despite hating France, he takes the girls there in 1769 out of reach of any accountability because the Foundling Hospital was known to sue people who do not treat their apprentices right. Thank God for that. They were isolated. At one point, he challenges a French officer to a duel for speaking to one of the girls. He sends one of them home the next year because they weren't intellectually satisfying him. Neither of the girls know going on. At 13 years old, Day rents a home for him and Sabrina, and as part of the education includes, training her to withstand physical so he drops hot wax on her, all of this stuff. He abandons this experiment in 1771 and sends Sabrina to a boarding school. Of course, after all that, he ends up marrying an heiress. Anyway, back to Clarence Hervey. Here's the thing, Clarence Hervey is written as honourable in the literal sense, he doesn't meddle with her. He never did what Day did to Sabrina. He kind of leaves her with a governess, with a chaperone, this elderly woman, and when rumours get out that he has a mistress and it's her, he is angry and also shocked, which is odd considering he's a man living in the world, but my theory is that he's compartmentalised, this so much, and her, and he doesn't see Virginia as a real person. I mean, literally, she's got a fictional character's name. Everything is in the future, not now. People are assuming that they're, hooking up, weird way to put it, but it's kind of the first thing that came into my head. He can't fathom having that kind of relationship with her because he doesn't view her in a sexual way. She's a concept, she's an idea to him. He doesn't spend lots of time with her, he pops in for visits here and there, and vice versa, because I think Virginia, she was banned from reading novels because of what that did to her mother and resulted to her birth. But she's allowed to read romances, and so she grows up with a very specific vision of the world. And because she's been isolated her whole life, first by her grandmother, and because her grandmother kept her, because she was like, oh, you're beautiful, and this is what happened to your mother, so I'm just going to keep you in this little cottage in the woods. She's looking for a hero, a protector, someone to come and save her, and she views Clarence Hervey as that. And even Clarence, he realises how stupid this whole thing is when he meets Belinda, and he realises that women who are in the real world, they can have that sort of simplicity of character and intelligence and grace and everything that he wants in a wife. And the naiveties of society, Virginia not knowing the ways of the world, that's not a good thing for a woman. Ironically, after grooming Virginia, he realises that she can't consent one way or another to marrying him or anything because she doesn't know what love is. She doesn't, romantic love is not the same as gratitude or friendship and, just general love. Edgeworth has to give Mr. Vincent a gambling problem to push Belinda back to Clarence Hervey, which at the time, being a gambler was one of the worst personal failings you could have. Not just for Belinda and Mr. Percival, was known to ruin families, and it was considered to be a sin against God as well if you were religious. And, even though it's not wholly Mr. Vincent's fault, there's a sense of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And, if someone's rejecting any help, then what can you do? So in a sense, what I would say about Clarence Hervey is he was kind of red-pilled. He was radicalized kind of by Rousseau and himself, and he kind of was unradicalized by having these figures like Mr. Percival and his friend Dr. X, who he is in fact called. Similarly to Lady Delacour, there's that comparison with the Percivals, and also the Percivals act as this kind of steadying course correction really in his life. And he finds better friends, he ends up doing well by Virginia and finding her father, so he doesn't leave her completely unprotected. Although that is kind of what upsets me as Virginia about this whole novel. It's everyone ends up who who they're supposed to be with, and that poor girl, I've been calling her Virginia, her name is Rachel. The book that she's named after, it is about the fate of a child of nature corrupted by the artificial sentimentality of the French upper classes in the late 18th century. I know she's fictional, but she's so scarred by everything that she's been through emotionally, being kept so secluded for her entire life by one person or another, then being ripped away from everything that she's ever known. She loses she's going through this whole thing, do I love Clarence Hervey? Am I just grateful to him? He's my whole world, he's given me everything. At one point she's really going through it. She's so worked up, and she's gone all through that for the character development of a man. And that really upsets me. To tell a moral lesson of, rationality and control over one's feelings, impulses, that's important. It's just so sad. She's learned submissiveness through her entire life and reliance on one trusted person. And she's just taking that into her relationship with her father. Yeah, I know she's got someone who she fell in love with this painting, and the guy who sat for the painting is a real person. And of course, he saved her father in the West Indies in battle during a slave uprising. So she's gonna have a happy ending, but still, at what cost to her mental health? So those are some of my thoughts on Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. I completely understand why Jane Austen loved her book so much. It was, such a smooth read. The language flows even in 2025. The characterization of Lady Delacour, the realism and social commentary wrapped up as this courtship novel. It was a really good time, and I was way more invested in the friendship between Belinda and Lady Delacour than I was between the love triangle. Harriet Freke and Lady Delacour, by far the most sort of interesting characters. You can see the influence that Maria Edgeworth has had on Jane Austen, and specifically Belinda has had quite a bit of influence on Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. And reading Maria Edgeworth was seriously overdue. Her writing about race and queerness also, like, it's quite a modern book, which I think is no doubt what drew Jane Austen to it and her. And I'm going to say, I think the popularity of Jane Austen has led people to believe that people weren't writing like as diversely as this and as about queerness and race. So it's great to actually kind of read some of that. And Harriet Freke, oh my God, it sucks that she was so cruel and nasty, because I would have rooted for her like way over Belinda. Like, I'm agreeing with her advocating for women's rights. Belinda was boring as hell, sorry. I just can't get over that. Harriet Freke kind of reminds me of like season 1 Damon Salvatore, you know? I would love to see a book where like that character falls in love and sees, you know, the error of her ways and all of that stuff, and like realizing that she doesn't have to be cruel and lash out, like, you know, she just needs someone to love her. That sounds so cheesy, but you know what I mean? Like, that is way more interesting to me than Belinda's love triangle. But yeah, this is where I'm gonna leave it, because I would just ramble from now on. So yeah, I'll be checking out Edgeworth's other novels for sure. Thank you for watching. This is gonna be a massive one, so do comment like Myrtle or chuck a flower emoji in actually, that's bot behavior. Something worded plus flower emojis, just so I can see who made it to the end. If you like this, do give it a thumbs up. I make videos all about books, history, culture, etc. So do check those out and subscribe if you would like to. Happy reading.